Hello, welcome back to the Engineered Microbes for Environmental Release virtual seminar series. Last week, Dr. Callie Chappelle introduced the Pandora's Walk framework for thinking about biotechnology and how to support community-level biotechnology. You can find the video of the presentation on our main page, as well as videos for the other links and for the other talks in the link in the chat that I'm posting right now. And our next guest joining the series is Dr. Riley Taitingfong, who will focus on practical tools and frameworks for supporting Indigenous governance of emerging biotechnologies with particular relevance for engineered microbes for environmental release. Riley is a researcher and educator interested in Indigenous governance of emerging technologies and data. She's currently a Lucy Foundation postdoctoral researcher for the Udall Center's Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona and the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance. There, she works with Indigenous data sovereignty experts around the globe to build tools to operationalize the CARE principles, which stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, for Indigenous data governance. She's also the director of the United States Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network and the co-director of the newly formed Indigenous Data Alliance. Riley earned her Ph.D. in the Department of Communication at the University of California, San Diego, where her project focused on Indigenous governance of genetic engineering technologies known as gene drives. She's also an experienced practitioner of community-based participatory research, and her teaching spans disability studies, environmental ethics, Indigenous data sovereignty, and critical approaches to science communication at UCSD, Harvard, and University of Arizona. Riley, we're really excited to have you here. Thank you so much for giving this talk, and please take it away.
Hello, Hafaday, and thank you, Kiara, for that introduction. I'm going to just get my slides going and jump right in. If you could give me a thumbs up if that looks good, or just let me know if not.
Yeah, everything looks good.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Wanasan Hafaday Menanahu Zemaniatluhu Guahosi Riley Taitingfong. As you heard, my name is Riley. I'm a postdoc, as Kiara said, at the University of Arizona, and also affiliated with these fabulous organizations you see at the bottom of this slide. I'll get to talk a little bit more about those at the very end of the presentation and ways that you can get in touch with us and some of the work that we do. So I'm going to jump right in. Here's the kind of roadmap for this presentation today. So I'm going to start with some introduction to myself, positioning myself for you all, and an introduction to this concept that I'm offering today of relational governance. What does that mean? How are we kind of defining that? And then the bulk of the talk is going to be spent sharing tools and frameworks for the Indigenous Data Sovereignty movement that I hope have some import for thinking about engineered microbes for environmental release. All righty, so jumping in. So first, I always like to start with acknowledging my relations, kind of the important people and places in my life, and relationships that really drive the work that I do and some of the perspectives that I bring to bear on that work. So on this slide, you see my family, my parents, Alan Suzanne Taitingfong, my late grandmother, Josefa Taitingfong, and Juan Taitingfong, my late grandfather, my late grandmother on my maternal side, Laura Flatt. And then in the bottom right, some pictures on my home island of Guahan or Guam in Oceania and Micronesia. This is us going to Fua Rock, which is an important site associated with our creation story in Micronesia and Guam. And then on the bottom right corner here, this is a group that I'm a part of that has been doing adult Chamorro language immersion. So Chamorro being the indigenous peoples and the indigenous language of the island of Guahan or Guam and the broader Marianas region. And so I got to be part of the very first ever adult-focused language immersion program on our home island. And so I share these things because, just as a little background for myself as a Chamorro person, we are the most geographically dispersed Pacific Islanders in the United States. This has a lot to do with the various intersecting systems of colonization and militarism that have impacted our lands and peoples. Think about patterns of displacement from military occupation of the island, patterns of outmigration, our peoples leaving our home islands. There are now more Chamorros living away from the Mariana Islands than in them. And a lot of this has to do with pressures around cultural assimilation and military enlistment, right? Guam, for those who don't know, is a unincorporated island territory of the United States, which gives very precarious political status and a lot of impacts by the US military. And so these are some of the kinds of things I'm thinking about when I'm looking at systems of power, also impacts on the environment in our home islands, and thinking about, how is it that we have so many of our people away from our home islands, and how can we stay in responsibility to our home islands wherever we go, which is why this language immersion has been such a great opportunity for that. And so while it's true that, these many waves of militarization and colonization that have met our islands' shores are a big reason we're so geographically dispersed, it's also very important to acknowledge that we have always been a people on the move, right? I'm proud to descend from some of the greatest oceanic voyagers, arguably ever to grace this planet, right? These are expert navigators who traversed some 4/5 of the Southern Hemisphere using just traditional techniques, and who likely did not see our islands as sort of isolated by the ocean, as many colonial narratives would later frame it, but rather as inseparable from and connected by it. And so on this slide, this is Uncle Mario Sacman Borja at UC San Diego. He's a cultural treasure, really, somebody who has been formative in re-inspiring and revitalizing canoe building and navigating for Chamorro people, particularly in the diaspora as well as in our home islands. And so here he is fixing a model to the wall at UCSD where he got to share some of his prototypes. On the right, this is a Marshallese stick chart. This is something used by navigators to kind of as a pedagogical tool to teach about navigation. The sticks show different wave patterns and swells, and the small shells show different archipelagos and islands. And so this is something that when I will later talk about Indigenous data sovereignty, I often use as an example to show how we've long been using, various physical and oral mechanisms for storing, preserving, transmitting, and sharing our data. And this is one very important one tied to this context of navigation. And then in the bottom, this is a really beautiful photo in San Diego, where I lived for the last 12, 13 years before coming back to Seattle, where I've grown up much of my life. This is some of the Kumeyaay tribe welcoming the Sacman Chamorro. This is our canoe taking to the sea for the first time in hundreds of years, since some of our wayfinding and navigation and canoe making and sailing practices were really disrupted by colonization. And so Uncle Mario and others were really figureheads in getting our canoes back on the water. And so this was one of the first places this got to happen. And I just like to share it as an example of how the work that diasporic Chamorros are doing reach many corners of the ocean and the world, and are done so in great connection, solidarity, relationship with other Indigenous peoples as well. And so again, when I talk in this presentation about things like relationality, connectivity, I just wanted to share a little bit of the personal and context that I'm bringing to bear on that. And so a little bit more about the work that I've done. As Kiara shared, my PhD is in communication studies from the University of California, San Diego. There, my training really focused a lot on, thinking about how power is communicated through social phenomenon, whether everyday practices to institutions and the media. And we had a really strong relationship with the science studies department and exchanges with all kinds of practitioners of science. And so I got really interested in kind of the intersection of communication, science studies, and then especially issues of community engagement and Indigenous governance. And so my early work started out of an interest in calls for community-based participatory research and how we would see those sort of increasingly circulating in science and medicine, but how sometimes those calls could fall short, right? All this interest and even funding from NIH, NSF, and others to be doing CBPR, but it would be kind of hard at times to fit it to sometimes to these incommensurate, if you will, systems for doing community engaged research, right? And I'll say more about that throughout the presentation. But so then my work kind of shifted to asking, how can we fill those gaps in trying to make good on these calls for CBPR with tools for strengthening Indigenous authority and rights in decision-making processes. And I really was looking at technologies that impact Indigenous lands, resources, and communities. And so while I was at UCSD, my dissertation ended up focusing on gene-derived technologies, which are genetic engineering techniques, many of which are designed to kind of self-propagate if and when released in the environment. So they raise really interesting questions about containment and spread. And I'll say a little bit more about where that project led. And more recently, I've been applying some of the lessons from gene drive technologies and governance to other environmental technologies, including with one of my colleagues, Natalie Kofler, who I'm writing a book with right now. And we're thinking about, how do these lessons about gene drive governance, the gaps, the things that might make it better, how can those be applied to things like de-extinction, solar geoengineering, and other sort of climate and environmental interventions? And then finally, and this is actually where a lot of the talk is going to focus today, in sort of my thirst to find more concrete tools, guiding frameworks to support the and strengthening of Indigenous governance, I found the Indigenous Data Sovereignty movement and really was inspired by the decades of great work done all around the world led by Indigenous peoples to build these kinds of tools and put these calls into action. So we're going to spend some time thinking about some of this today. Okay, so I will very happily not say a whole lot about my dissertation project today, but I do want to just frame a couple of key takeaways because it's sort of an important genealogy for what led me to want to propose this framework of relational governance. And so if there's a punchline of the dissertation work, it's that isolation is a limiting framework, right? Because gene drive technologies pose such intense risks with respect to spread, islands quickly became the sort of taken for granted and assumed ideal trial site for these technologies. And I've published and written my dissertation about this and how this sort of, knee-jerk move to look at islands as good test sites for these technologies is less some, empirical truth and more an instance of this powerful colonial myth of the isolated island laboratory at work. And I am far from the first to say this, and I would be remiss to not shout out the greats, like, for example, Apeli Hau'ofa, who was a poet, a writer, a scholar from Oceania. If you haven't read his work, please go read We Are the Ocean. It's beautiful and inspirational and really elegantly articulates why, isolation is just a more recent colonial narrative and one that our ancestors were certainly not thinking with when they navigated so much of the ocean with such expertise. And so to say just one more thing about some of the takeaways from this project. So again, the kind of big picture here is that containment and isolation are salient but limited frames for gene drive research and engagement. And I think there's a lot we can draw from this to apply to other technologies as well. Within that, I argued that the framing of islands as naturally contained and therefore sort of amenable to these forms of experimentation really obscures the displacement of risk onto those island geographies. And that this framing of isolation and containment didn't only show up in sort of the, lab to field pipeline, but also in the ways community and public engagement were being shaped at various sites where I did ethnographic research. And so what I mean by this is different sort of strategic approaches to engaging the community and conversations around the potential use of gene drive, right? Really ended up looking more like marketing approaches, like deficit model approaches in many cases, and that these limited approaches really act in and of themselves as a form of containment, right? Anticipating and containing opposition in many cases, sort of trying to manufacture consent, and in doing so, foreclosing opportunities for mutual learning and sharing of expertise that could actually be really scientifically and ethically important for how we choose where and when to deploy these kinds of technologies. So long story short, the argument here is that these frames really aren't doing us any favors. And so instead, I invite alternatives that might honor connectivity, right? That kind of oceanic relationship and framing. And one framing that I've landed on with Dr. Kofler that I mentioned from the book project is this of relational governance. And so this is definitely still in development. When our book is out, we'll have a whole chapter on this concept and what it's looking like sort of in practice. But what we've defined so far is that relational governance recognizes connectivity. It values relationships and responsibility. It expands who has authority and voice, and it values diverse ways of knowing. And so I'll just sit with this for a moment just to let people kind of absorb. And so I'm going to offer a couple of kind of high-level guiding questions that I invite all of you to think with as I'm speaking through some of the more grounded examples in this talk. And just, curious how, if at all, you think you would like to see governance practices change, or maybe even your own scientific practice for those of you working in that space to be more relational and what that might look like. And so here's these high-level guiding questions. So what if connectivity were the starting point for the governance of engineered microbes for environmental release? And how might Indigenous governance tools and frameworks apply to this context? And so I'm going to now launch into what will be really the longest and the bulk of this talk. And in doing so, I first want to kind of back up and set a little bit of the stage for, why should we even be thinking about Indigenous peoples as an important group when it comes to biotech governance. So for those not aware, Indigenous peoples make up just 6% of the global population, and their lands comprise some quarter of the Earth's surface, and those lands contain some 80% of its remaining biodiversity. And so for millennia, Indigenous peoples have tended these lands, waters, and ecosystems by innovating and preserving sophisticated knowledge systems. And so this is where you start to see this draw toward Indigenous participation and what some of you may be familiar with as TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, in the sciences and in climate science and environmental science work as well. And so this is a project from one of my colleagues, Dr. Dominique David Chavez. So she was looking at this phenomenon of, increasing interest in TEK, or Indigenous knowledges, in climate research. And so she conducted a global systematic review of over 20 years of climate science studies that included Indigenous knowledges in some way. And she analyzed how these studies engaged the Indigenous peoples to whom those knowledges belong. And she made this spectrum. So on the left, this is more extractive research practices, right? Using Indigenous knowledges without community involvement or consent, all the way to the right, which she calls more self-determined, which are Indigenous-led and authored kinds of projects involving Indigenous knowledge. And so what she found was that the vast majority of climate studies, at some 87% of her data set, fell on this extractive side of the spectrum, right? And so this means, again, those Indigenous knowledges were being included in some sense in the science, but there was little to no community involvement, consent, or consultation. Studies that engage Indigenous community members as equal decision makers or leaders in shaping the research process were present, but kind of fewer and further between. And so this is really important, right? Because as we see these increased calls for Indigenous engagement and knowledge to, in some sense, kind of save us from the climate crisis, right, in this work, it's really important that we don't slip into these extractive modes of practice, right? And that Indigenous people's rights are upheld in this space. And so I really like to emphasize that this isn't just about really, being a good and ethical researcher. This is about upholding Indigenous rights. And so often when framing Indigenous people's rights to, shape decisions about technologies and interventions that impact their resources, their lands, their communities, we often invoke UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is just one sort of international level mechanism that enshrines these Indigenous rights. And so I put together just a glimpse of a few articles that I think connect to biotech governance, such as Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, including over the use of biotech on their lands and impacting their resources. We might also think about the right to participate in decision-making processes, which is articulated in Article 18. And this, connects to the use of, this connects to Indigenous people's rights to be part of those decisions in meaningful ways, right? We might also think about things like FPIC, free prior informed consent, which ought to apply to the more upstream steps, even like technology design, not just sort of downstream deployment, which is where I often think this kinds of comes into the frame. And there are many more, but just wanted to share this to give you a snapshot. And again, I think these really underscore this essential point that Indigenous peoples are, again, rights holders, not just stakeholders, which is often the language we see, at least in the gene drive and genetic engineering space when it comes to who ought to be shaping decisions about the use of these technologies and how. And so importantly, these rights really form the basis of Indigenous data sovereignty. And I'm going to use IDSOV as shorthand, but to put a finer point on what IDSOV is, this refers to the rights of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, use of their data really across the entire data lifecycle and in any data ecosystem where their data exist, right? So again, these really are positioned within these human rights frameworks, mechanisms like UNDRIP, amongst other tools. It really affirms that knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who Indigenous peoples are. And it derives from these really strong and long held roles, traditions, responsibilities that communities have had for the use of their information. And so on an earlier slide, I shared the Marshallese stick chart as one example of, Indigenous data sharing for millennia now. And it's true that Indigenous peoples have always been data experts, right, in stewarding those kinds of data sharing mechanisms and tools. And it's also true that they've always had certain protocols for how you share or don't share that information. And so when we talk about IDSOV today, we're talking about upholding Indigenous rights. We're talking about taking those responsibilities and protocols for the use of Indigenous people's data and applying them to data wherever they live. And it's really not just sort of binary ones and zeros data. It's data meaning any information relating to or originating from Indigenous peoples. Okay, and so now I want to share a framework that I've worked really close with in my postdoc. These are the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance, and Kiara mentioned these in my introduction today. And these really were developed by my supervisor, Stephanie Carroll, and other Indigenous and allied colleagues. They came together at the Research Data Alliance back in 2018 at the Botswana meeting and had an interest in developing something to respond to these sort of increasing calls for open data sharing in science, right? And so they did a sort of a side-by-side looking at what are the qualities of mainstream data sharing principles, right? If you work in this world, you may be familiar, for example, with the FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And they compared frameworks like that to Indigenous peoples' frameworks for the care of their data. And what they found was that the mainstream data principles were much more focused on sort of data as discrete objects, really the qualities or attributes of those data. Whereas Indigenous peoples' frameworks for data were really about people and purpose. They were about, how do you ensure Indigenous peoples can benefit from the use of their data, right? How do you uphold Indigenous peoples' rights and well-being in data? And so this is where CARE comes from. And so this just gives you a breakdown of the principles, C, A, R, and E, and 3 sub-principles under each. I won't read it at every line at you, but just to get a sense. So collective benefit, as I said, is really concerned with, uses of Indigenous people's data, deriving benefit back to those peoples and communities. Authority to control is what we really see as the heart of CARE. And this is about upholding Indigenous people's rights and interests, also ensuring that they have access to timely and accurate data to inform their governance projects and decisions. And it also includes mechanisms for the governance of those data, again, in alignment with the protocols and expectations Indigenous peoples have for their data. R for responsibility is really thinking about things like positive relationships, also expanding capacity, honoring Indigenous languages and worldviews. And then E ethics gets us thinking about things like minimizing harm and maximizing benefit, issues of justice and future use. And so I think that care, comes from this distinct context and origin in the Indigenous data sovereignty movement, but I think it has a lot to actually offer us as a potentially useful lens for thinking about governance of environmental biotechnology, right? To guide decision making about who benefits, who decides, who holds responsibility when technologies are released into shared ecosystems. And so what might it look like to kind of spell this out and apply this high level guidance to this context, right? What if we take this as a framework for the governance of biotech? And I'm drawing some inspiration from an exercise that some of us had done out of a recent Caltech workshop on biotech. Your previous speaker, Dr. Callie Chappelle, was also a part of this team. And I think this is something that we can also apply to this context. So I'm just posing these kind of high level questions, and I invite you to try these on for size, see how they may or may not fit in your context. And then after sharing these, I'm going to turn to some more concrete examples in practice. So if we're thinking about C collective benefit in this context, we might ask, do the goals and outcomes of the use of a microbial intervention represent meaningful benefits to impacted communities? For A, authority to control, perhaps we might ask how the decision-making process can be improved to ensure rights holders participate in those decisions in meaningful and authoritative ways. For our responsibility, we might ask what long-term responsibilities do, say, developers and institutions have for things like monitoring, stewardship, and responding to impacts after the release, including potential unintended consequences. And then finally, for e-ethics, maybe we'll ask, how are cultural, ecological, and relational connections to lands, waters, and species recognized in decisions about environmental interventions? Okay. And so as said, to round out this talk, I want to now offer some more kind of grounded examples in practice to show how care is being operationalized in the Indigenous data sovereignty and governance space. And I'll try to draw some connections to the EMER space as well. And so to do this, I'm going to draw on my main postdoc project, which I've been leading over the last 3 years to develop this assessment tool for care. This is called the Care Data Maturity Model. You can read more about this. That QR code should take you to the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance site where we host this. This has been a labor of love many years in the making and is getting ready to launch at our summit next month. So you'll have like a whole toolkit you can use online. But essentially, the Care Data Maturity Model takes those high-level care principles that I showed you and translates them into more than 150 indicators across CAR and E that offer concrete recommendations and actions for a variety of data actors to put these principles into motion. And so promise not to read every single one of these at you, but this is available on our website. And this is sort of the indicators at a glance, just summaries of the kinds of activities that we've recommended under CAR and E. And I've highlighted just a few that I think might have particular import for the context we're discussing today. And I'll just pick out a few to mention, but things like thinking about benefit sharing plans, and I'll give an example of that in a few minutes. Making sure there's practices in place to disclose project risks and benefits for Indigenous peoples. We talked about the importance of free prior informed consent, which I think is a complex question when it comes to technologies that are, inevitably going to move and interact with complex and intersecting and overlapping geographies and ecosystems, but an important one to think of nonetheless. For our responsibility, we might think about tools like relationship agreements amongst different practitioners, developers, and communities who may partner together, and also how to really build up Indigenous communities' own capacity and capability, maybe even to develop and design some of these technologies themselves. And then finally, for e-ethics, we might think about opportunities to weave Indigenous ethical frameworks into some of the tech design or decision-making frameworks concerning the tech, and also importantly, respect authority of Indigenous decision-making bodies, right? There's many scales of governance that do and don't overlap in different situations. And Indigenous peoples often have their own governments and governance protocols and mechanisms that ought to be upheld in decisions about these technologies. Okay. So now I'm going to offer some examples across C, A, R, and E to kind of bring us home. And so again, we have developed more than 125 indicators. They're in no way sort of comprehensive of all the ways you could put care into action, but they do give us some really strong building blocks for, as we like to say, creating an enabling environment where Indigenous data governance can thrive. So again, with your help, and I need your help because I don't think too often or have the expertise that you do about the microbial sort of space. I would love to hear in the Q&A or discussion, which of these examples do or don't resonate or may apply to your context. And so with that, we'll start with this example from C, collective benefit. And this is about the development of benefit sharing models and agreements. So I drew this example from Variant Bio. They're a genomics-driven drug discovery pharmaceutical company. And they, in 2020, developed a benefit sharing plan that commits to sharing 4% of their revenue plus 4% of their equity value with partner communities who, in this case, have shared their DNA to inform research conducted by Variant Bio and drug development conducted by Variant Bio, as well as other health information. And so there's a New York Times article that gave us an update on, how they're making on this benefit sharing pledge. And 4 years into their program, they had distributed over $1 million in those short-term benefit sharing funds for projects spanning over a dozen countries in all 6 continents. And so for thinking about engineered microbes, if communities, lands, waters, ecological knowledge make certain microbial innovations possible, how can the communities to whom those knowledges and resources belong, meaningfully benefit from the commercial developments or outcomes of those technologies, right? So, for instance, we might imagine any commercial technologies or products developed from those knowledges or Indigenous data or on Indigenous lands may create a similar revenue sharing model to what Variant Bio has. Or maybe there's a way to create an upfront and ongoing fund for locally defined environmental or community priorities. We could think also about ways to take some of those profits and invest them back into local scientific stewardship and capacity. And maybe some of these things are already in motion in this context as well. Okay, I want to share an example that I think really spans authority to control, responsibility, and ethics quite beautifully. For those not familiar, these are local context labels and notices. Local context is an organization that created these sort of digital tags that essentially communicate things like Indigenous provenance, Indigenous governance protocols, and Indigenous authority associated with data. And so on the right, they have notices. These are for use by institutions and researchers, and then labels. These are customized by communities. And so, for example, you have institutional notices that say like open to collaborate. And so I've seen, for instance, an environmental DNA project out of the University of Maine put that open to collaborate notice on their webpage saying, we know we work on Indigenous lands and with Indigenous data, and we would love to work with tribes and communities in this region. And I know that has led to partnerships in that project that have been really fruitful. And then the Indigenous communities labels, and these are TK for traditional knowledge and BC for biocultural. These can communicate, specific governance protocols or provenance information as determined by Indigenous peoples. And here's an example of a notice sort of in situ in a peer-reviewed journal article. This is an article that uses and references genomic data from a bilberry plant that was sourced from Indigenous Sapmi lands. And so you can see the map shows where the sample was taken from, and it has this visible BC notice. And then in their data availability statement, they note that there are accompanying cultural rights and responsibilities that need further attention for any sharing or use of this material or data. And so again, visibly communicating the cultural rights and authority that sit in relationship to these data. And so I wonder, would there be a way to apply these labels or notices in the context of engineered microbes for environmental release? Might we apply them to microbial samples taken from Indigenous territories, environmental data associated with Indigenous territories, ecosystems, or lands? And might these be used in some way to signal community authority or stewardship, to signal specific conditions for use, or maybe to signal whether environmental release has been sort of deemed appropriate in different contexts? So I could imagine maybe like a community authorization required label appearing on research proposals or field trial applications, or maybe restricted seasonally tags could flag ecosystems that might be sensitive at a certain time of year. Or things like cultural stewardship area could mark territories where community governance must be consulted prior to any release. Okay, checking the time. I'm going to give us one more example for e-ethics and then close us out. So again, e-ethics from CARE gets us thinking about issues of justice, minimizing harm. And to do this, we really need a good picture of the already unequal ways that power circulates and risks are distributed in the context of these various biotechnologies. And, this can be sort of difficult to track in biotech. In my dissertation project, I pitched the idea of mapping power with respect to gene drive development, specifically by looking at where the technologies are being funded, well, who's funding them, where they're being developed, right? And then where are early trials sort of proposed to take place. And so this map is by now quite outdated, but it visualizes the UK-based biotech company Oxitec, their genetically modified mosquito trials from 2011 to 2021. And so as you can see, the developers in blue, the funders are in green, and the field trial sites are in red. And so you quickly begin to see this sort of global north-south phenomenon happening, right? Where the resources to fund and develop these technologies are overwhelmingly concentrated in the north, and the places that are cited for field trials overwhelmingly in the south. And there's a number of reasons this is the case, but I think it really helps to visualize and paint the picture that there are going to be these uneven flows of power and power imbalances and differences we need to be thinking about when it comes to how the people in these places throughout the global south are able to meaningfully shape these decisions about the use of technologies in these areas. Okay, and then also, again, outdated numbers, but from my dissertation research, just trying to kind of make transparent the top funders at the time of gene drive research. Among these, the Tata Trusts, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and their Target Malaria arm. And then interestingly, and at the time, most significantly, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, which is a US military agency. And so for all of the conversations and fora in which I talked with people about gene drive ethics, right, safe deployment, all of these things, it was so rare that we actually had, a direct conversation about what it means that the US military actually has such a strong role in shaping research agendas and deliverables, right, with these different grants, supporting the development of these technologies and also some of the social and ethical side of it. So this is something that I think is really important to visualize and to bring directly into conversations about making more equitable decision-making projects. And so related to this, one project that I worked on, interestingly enough, funded by a DARPA grant, was about exploring the value of a global gene drive project registry. And so we convened a whole bunch of folks working in all corners of the kind of gene drive space, right, to talk about what might it look like to have a registry. Could it help, as we say, to make these kinds of patterns of power more visible? I think often when you look at other kinds of registries there, and including the arguments for gene drive registries, they're framed as a way to sort of promote coordination across different labs who might be developing related technologies, right? Also to promote transparency by actually providing kind of outward and publicly accessible information around where these technologies are being developed and for what purpose. And to that end, I think these could be a really useful way to make visible essentially who's doing what, where, and with whose involvement or money, right? Kind of surfacing at times what are otherwise opaque networks of funding, development, and deployment. And so, this could also be a powerful tool even for communities and impacted areas to kind of have a sense of what's going on. And, I can talk more about this in the Q&A. I think the proposal of a registry is not without a whole lot of challenging logistical, technical, and social questions to be worked out. But you can also read the paper if you want to dive more into that. Okay. I'm going to just turn us to a conclusion now. And in doing so, I want to return back to those guiding questions, bring them back to the top of your mind for our Q&A and discussion, right? Again, what could it look like, in particularly in your context, if connectivity, right, not containment or isolation, were sort of the starting point for governance of engineered microbes for environmental release? How might those Indigenous governance frameworks and tools that I've shared apply to your context? How might they not? And what questions do you have about them? And I just want to offer that, if environmental biotech like engineered microbes are going to enter these complex social and ecological relationships, right, then our governance systems need to be equipped to embrace, navigate, and leverage that complexity to make good decisions. And so moving from containment to approaches that are more of relational accountability, I think offers one pathway for doing that. And I hope I've given some food for thought for our discussion to dive into how that might look. Oh, and if you're hungry for more about Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance, I'd like to personally invite you to the summit that the organization that I co-direct is hosting in Tucson in just a few weeks. If you can't make it in person, we have virtual registration and it is still open. This is going to be a fantastic convening of data practitioners, tribes, and Indigenous communities from the US and beyond. So please join us if you're able and let me know if you have any questions about that. And with that, I will say a big Sainamase. Thank you so much, especially to the planning team for this seminar series. Again, it's an honor to join such a fantastic lineup of speakers. And I want to acknowledge the Baker Institute, the Rice University Synthetic Biology Institute, and the organizations that I've mentioned today that I'm affiliated with as well and supported this work. And here's my email if you ever want to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riley. Thank you for sharing the care framework and the TK labels for ways that emerging biotechnologies can respect Indigenous governance, and also for reminding us that connectivity and not containment should be a guiding principle in how EMERs are developed. For the audience, make sure to use the Q&A function on Zoom to submit any questions, and I'm going to do my best to consolidate them and read them out for Riley to respond, but I have a couple questions here to get us started. So maybe like a controversial thing, but there was a Senate proposal earlier this month for a bill that would seek to advance biotechnology by making a project to collect, catalog, and sequence genomic information of many species, and this is including microbes, in U.S. national parks. How do you see these proposals for bioprospecting in general, or like using getting all of all of this genomic data from places intersecting with Indigenous data governance?
Ooh, big question. And
It's a very meaty question.
And I don't know, by the way, if you're able to stick the questions in the chat, Kiara, or if I'm just not looking in the right place, but it helps me to be able to read them there too.
Yeah, this is the one that I prepared in advance. So I'll just put it up.
A great one. Yeah. Yeah, this is big. I mean, it reminds me of other sort of global and international projects for genomic data collection, and that, at times haven't really given much thought to the issue of Indigenous data governance. I am encouraged that there are folks kind of championing Indigenous data sovereignty in different global organizations. The GBIF, the Global Bioinformation Facility, Biodiversity Information Facility, has a task group led by one of my colleagues, Professor Lydia Jennings, for Indigenous data governance. And so I would say that would be an interesting group to look to for some of the work that they're developing, recommendations, policy they're developing around supporting global biodiversity data collection. Also, Anne McCartney, who has been doing a consultancy with the UN, I believe the Convention on Biological Diversity, and specifically work around DSI, digital sequence information, genomic information drawn, including, I believe, from environmental data. She's looked at ways to kind of better action the Nagoya Protocol and different protections in place around Indigenous data, applying it to genomics. So I guess long story short, there's like really good work being done in the biodiversity and environmental sciences space, trying to bridge the connection to Indigenous data sovereignty. I think tools like the local context labels and notices are fantastic and being taken up by all kinds of different sort of data actors, data repositories, right? To show what it can look like to at least make sure that, for example, like Indigenous provenance information is recorded with the collection of these samples and associated data. So to me, that would be one really important and obvious place to start, would be finding sort of champions for these tools within some of these infrastructures where these data will be stored or moving around or analyzed, and then also kind of targeting different points of intervention for policy. So one project that we work on right now is around publication of Indigenous data in science and beyond, and really helping develop kind of robust recommendations and guidelines that can be adopted and endorsed by journals or editorial bodies, right, pertaining to Indigenous data sovereignty. So for example, we've found examples of policies where if you're going to, journal policies, right, peer-reviewed journals that say if you're going to talk at all about Indigenous peoples' issues, especially if you're going to try to republish Indigenous data, you need to show proof of consent from the Indigenous peoples to whom those data belong or originate, and even show processes that have been taken up for engagement of Indigenous communities. Some journals will even like fully desk reject articles that come in that haven't shown that process. So yeah, long story short, there's like a lot of really amazing work being done in so many spaces that I think could, inform important policy for what's coming down the pipeline that you highlighted for us.
Here's a question from Sam Evans, which is really appreciate your work here, Riley. While DARPA was productively engaging in the early advancement of gene drives, with leadership change, it seems that most of that institutional knowledge has been lost. A recent DARPA announcement was for developing a gene drive for modifying brown tree snakes on Guam and seems to have developed without local engagement. When care principles are not being adhered to, and a project like this comes out, what options do you think local communities should explore, and how can those of us not in these communities support them?
Thank you. Hi, Sam. Thank you for that fantastic question. And I've been following the development of that project in my home island, and with some trepidation at times. I think, so first of all, it's a really great point you raise about just like kind of the human infrastructure and piece of how different projects and like funding bodies change over time. I think one thing that's really important for sustaining the change for Indigenous data sovereignty and governance work inside of these, governmental agencies and institutional bodies is doing so in a way that can like kind of, if at all possible, persist and be resilient through different changes in leadership. We've seen this very deeply challenged with this administration. I won't even say anything more about that, but that is one thing that we think about a lot when we make recommendations around actioning care, is like, how can you try and make systems and policies that are a little bit more resilient to, as you say, like over transition or changeover of leadership and things like this. I think it's really important that communities like those in Guahan just have their own kind of independent structures and infrastructures for data governance, right? For research governance. Many tribes across the US have their own institutional review boards. This is a model that I think I would love to see be taken up in our home islands. in kind of more structured ways. I mean, we certainly have our sort of informal protocols and processes for decision making that involve checking with certain elders or people. There's village level governance structures and such. And I think with proposed interventions like the one you note around the brown tree snake and others sort of being looked at in places like Guam, I think those need to be strengthened and made visible and be required in other external policies to be engaged if possible. And so, like I mentioned, with some of these journal policies that point back to like the kind of local and specific approval processes of Indigenous communities, I would love to, in my dream of dreams, see, gene drive regulatory guidance or requirements that say you actually need to, before release, produce documentation that you've engaged an Indigenous community on their own terms and through their governance structures that they've identified. We are suffering from poor design of decision-making processes across like the EPA, the FDA, and other bodies that may be involved in the regulation of these kinds of technologies, right? Like a 30-day public comment period when so many decisions about the design and the trial site and deployment of the technology have already been made is simply not enough. I think many people, including like in the National Academies report, WHO, the Convention on Biological Diversity, have been long calling for earlier engagement. And, there's no shortage of articles about this, but it's still not happening that well that I can see. So including in this context in Guahan, I will say there's really fantastic work being led by, in particular, like Chamorro women and some allied researchers who spend time in the Marianas, who have published papers around Chamorro and local, Guam-based folks' perspective on these kinds of technologies and just the issue of the brown tree snake. And we're fortunate that they've done that great work and that some of that data exists in the form of peer-reviewed papers. And so I would hope at the very least that folks who are involved in that DARPA project are looking to those bodies of scholarship and working to the extent that they can with those leaders and scholars to understand what the complex context on the ground there is, especially with relationship to the US military. So I could talk about that forever, but I'll leave it there and just say thank you for that important question.
And so a little bit more on that, on earlier engagement. And I think part of it has to do with people in biotechnology saying, well, this doesn't apply to me. Indigenous data sovereignty does not apply to me because we're not doing this. So in that, could you, with other forms of biotechnology that create value other than with profit sharing, how would those intersect with Indigenous data governance and Indigenous data sovereignty? For example, how could people working in labs with microbes interact with the CARE framework or apply these TK labels, maybe like a grad student or, in that sort of thinking? And I'll post the question.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think one question, like when we define Indigenous data in the Indigenous data sovereignty movement, we do so broadly, right? So we're talking about any data, including information about, our non-human kin, which could include microbes, right? Where are those data taken from? So I think one step is to try and like kind of audit the data, the samples, the technologies that you're working with, and is there any Indigenous provenance sort of implicated? And if so, are there relationships that you can build back with the people or communities to whom those data relate, and partner and work together to try and, build shared visions for how that technology develops? I mean, I think I always love a genuine CBPR approach, which is partnering with the community before you've even collected the data or formed a research question. I think that there's so much to offer from these technologies. I know others have talked about like bioremediation, which is huge when we think about these really highly militarized lands and islands that, deal endlessly with these legacies of contamination. And I would love to see these like microbial interventions developed in partnership with communities in these places that could benefit from them. And so I think, ideally you'd be making those relationships really upstream, including if you're a grad student in a lab, or at least just learning about what some of those applications or interventions might look like, and trying to approach some community engaged practices with that. I think the TK labels and BC notices are, because they're so customizable. I think there's many uses, for tracking that provenance information, but also by the institutions. So if you're like someone who's newly thinking about this work and you're in an institution that, say, engages with Indigenous data or is on Indigenous lands, like you might just go browse the TK BC labels and trainings, maybe attend one of our IDSOF trainings and see what might be relevant for your lab or your department or your university to put on their site. Like I said, the main eDNA project, that was the project I cited in the talk. They're a really great example to look to as well, to see how, they've made this statement saying, we recognize we work with Indigenous data and on Indigenous territories. We'd love to work with tribes, Indigenous peoples in this area. And they've developed great relationships out of it. So I would say just even familiarizing yourself with these tools and the many ways they are already in use might give you some ideas for how it could work in your space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just I think often us we get so concerned with not being experts in the kind of like the cultural topics and like the indigenous data sovereignty topics that I think a lot of us we don't engage in it out of fear of non-expertise, but I think it's important to try for sure.
Yeah, and
Well,
maybe I'll just add to that, CARE is specifically developed out of an Indigenous data sovereignty context. There are also applications of CARE beyond those contexts, like working with other communities who are impacted by certain decisions around data or technology. I've seen some really interesting work about using CARE to guide kind of data collection practices in like active war zones, and thinking about the sensitivity of data from refugee communities, some of whom are Indigenous and some of whom aren't. So I think that it's just because it is that really like high level kind of abstract principle and guidance, like I think it's just really good food for thought for how you can restructure your research or your practice to think about these dimensions of collective benefit, authority, and so on. So don't be afraid to try it on and see how it might apply to a different context. I get, again, while always recognizing where it comes from, and that, the heart of CARE is about Indigenous authority, but I've seen really interesting ways people have extended it to other contexts as well.
yeah, that's great. And actually that's a really good segue into like our next talk. So first I wanted to thank you so much for the great talk and thank you for everybody that made the time to come see it. I'm about to put a link in the chat this time. I'll actually put it in the chat for real for the next talk in the series. And it's going to be by Dr. Jason Porter on Wednesday, April 1st. Keep in mind that there was a time change on this talk, so we're going to see you at 2 p.m. Central instead of noon Central for this talk. But because we're talking about the delivered release of engineered microbes into the environment, we need an understanding of kind of the historical context that gave rise to the sustainability challenges that these technologies aim to address. So why do we even have to get rid of pollution, right? So Dr. Porter is going to use the history of arsenic as a case study by tracing its history from its cycles through geology, biology, and society through like an environmental justice lens. So please check out the website to register for all the talks, register for the next talk in the series. It's in the chat again. And yeah, and in case you missed it, you can check out the all of the talks that we've already had in the YouTube link below. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you all in April. Thank you.